So last week we began our study in the area of epistemology with a broad exploration of the general terrain of the field as a whole. We looked at the challenge of skepticism. We looked at various aspects of the problem of knowledge. And we looked at different aspects of how to go about justifying our beliefs or justifying our claims to knowledge, as well as different theories of truth. This week, we now turn to the historical dialogue more specifically, and we target a tension between two prominent schools of thought, the rationalists and the empiricists. While this tension can be found throughout history, it has been felt full force since the rise of the Enlightenment. But before we meet our Enlightenment philosophers, let us go back and retrace certain developments in the history of Western thought. Now, I mentioned last week that we can find historically a sort of circle of skepticism, as I sometimes call it, or a line of despair, where we begin with inquiry, we rise to confidence and seeking certainty, we find counterpoint, perhaps we find pluralism, we are pushed back to a position of doubt, we find ourselves slipping towards skepticism, and from the platform of skepticism, we may find our epistemic certainty slipping further toward a position of relativism. So that is the epistemic struggle, but there is a metaphysical struggle that is directly connected to that. This is the dualistic struggle. To use Platonic language, it is the tension between claims of truth relating to inside the cave versus claims of truth relating to things beyond the cave. This is the tension between the material and the immaterial, between claims of universals, truths that apply universally to all things, versus claims of the particulars, truths that only apply to one particular thing in one place at one time. It is the tension between the visible and the invisible or the intelligible, the realm of the physical and the realm of ideas. So really there are two questions here that go hand in hand. Although when we study epistemology, we are dealing with the how do you know question, it is inseparable from the metaphysical question. So the two questions that go hand in hand are what is real? That's a metaphysical question. And concerning that question, we face the epistemological question. How do you know what is real? So let's set the stage for the Enlightenment tension by first revisiting the history of philosophy. The ancient world was largely religious in one way or another. The rise of the discipline of philosophy began largely from an interest in cosmology. Where did we come from, and what is the ultimate nature of reality? This, by the way, was a shared concern between Eastern and Western schools of thought. Insofar as the notion of a harmonic order relates to geometry and mathematics, such inquiry led naturally to developments in music and astronomy. The Greeks at this time, now known as the pre-Socratics, were especially eager to explain the one versus the many. Is reality ultimately one kind of stuff or different kinds of stuff? On the one hand, it seems as though all of reality must be traceable back to a sense of singularity, one thing that holds all things together. But then, what would explain the fact that we experience so many things, multiplicities, within the world? Now, Greek philosophy at this time was, to a significant degree, elemental philosophy, that is, philosophy concerned with the nature of the elements, or the nature of matter, or the stuff of which we are composed. Now, given that nature is alive and growing and changing, it is easy to suppose that the stuff of which nature is composed is itself animated. Moreover, since the nature of nature is in many ways cyclical, that is, it involves repetitive stages or seasons, such as birth, growth, maturity, decay, death leads to new life, etc., it is not unreasonable to suppose that reality then is one ultimate kind of stuff that has gone through different stages and manifested itself in different ways in different stages. Keep in mind that matter on this view is animated or alive. So then the question becomes, what was that fundamental element of nature or reality which has manifested itself in so many ways throughout time? Well, Thales of Miletus suggested that the original principle of nature was water, and everything else ultimately came from water, and even perhaps depends upon water to a large degree. Now, to many, this may seem a really weird claim, really far-fetched, out of left field, so to speak. However, maybe it is not an unheard of suggestion. For example, in the biblical literature, in the book of Genesis, it reads, "And God said, let there be an expanse between the waters to separate water from water." So first there was the water, the first material substance there. And then an expanse was created between the waters. Reading on, so God made the expanse and separated the water under the expanse from the water above it. And so God called the expanse sky. And it goes on to read, "And God said, let the water under the sky be gathered in one place, and let dry ground appear." So, all that to say, maybe this notion of everything ultimately coming from a principal material of water is not as far-fetched as some may think. Others came along and countered, well, maybe fundamental reality was not water, but fire, or maybe wind. And with time, some suggested, well, maybe it's not just one kind of stuff. Maybe the foundational nature of reality involves several elements in relation to one another, like earth, fire, wind, and water. And if any of you lived through the 90s, then you know if you throw a little heart in there, you get Captain Planet. Now, this kind of elemental philosophy shows up a lot in various sorts of earth-focused religions, as well as in westernized New Age syncretisms. When I say Western syncretism, I mean that in the US especially, we have a habit of not buying full force into any one ideology, but approaching worldviews like a buffet and taking a little bit of this and a little bit of this view and a little bit of this religion, not looking at the fact that these ideas clash with one another, but trying to make them all work. The New Age movement has a lot of that in it. And so, along with many other ideas, you see within the New Age movement part of that elemental philosophy and religious influences coming into the equation. Now, as different as the histories of Western and Eastern philosophy may be, there are a few points where ancient Eastern philosophy and ancient Western philosophy overlap quite a bit. And those points include the assumption that there is an underlying grand order to the universe, that this grand order reveals itself in mathematics and in music, the significance of virtue ethics, and in this elemental philosophy. So here in the East, whereas the Greeks were considering earth, water, fire, and wind, in the East, it was earth, wood, fire, metal, and water. And I'm not going to go into all of this, but you can see here how you get certain cycles of creation and destruction, and this sense of everything being interrelated and there being a grand order to everything. It is also interesting that you can find the Pythagorean pentagon and pentagram here as well. Now, that point about there existing an underlying rational order to the universe is a significant one, which most certainly plays into the epistemological questions before us. In Greek thought, the logos referred to an underlying rational order. There is a universal divine reason, a perfect rational order present within yet transcending nature and observable to anyone who seeks it. Now, whether the logos is part of the animated matter or beyond matter is a different question. But it's important to understand the idea that the order is there. In the East, it was called the Tao, the way things should go. There's an underlying natural order within the universe, and everything has a way that it ought to flow. But back to Western philosophy, in light of that circle of skepticism, or the line of inquiry up to certainty, down to skepticism, and possibly to relativism, we are now inquiring and growing more confident. As such inquiry led to greater clarity and thoughtfulness, progress created a growing sense of optimism concerning our ability to know deep truths about our world. Rationalism, in its earliest form, was born from a willingness to follow an argument to wherever it leads, even if it leads to an uncomfortable conclusion. With time, however, three important concepts arose concurrently. First, atomism. Atomism was a Greek philosophy that only the physical world exists, and everything reduces either to atoms or to a void. So atomism is really one of our first articulated philosophies for something like materialism, that there is nothing beyond matter. Now, at the time, atomism seemed to best account for what seemed to be missing in other cosmological theories. And so, atomism led to a rise in skepticism that any truths, including moral truths, exist beyond the atoms. This rise in skepticism eventually led to sophism, which included the idea that truth, which would include moral truth, reduces to relativism. And philosophy, then, is not a quest for some ultimate truth lying beyond the atoms. It is merely a language game. And as you know by now, this is where we meet the Socratics. You're looking at Raphael's School of Athens, Raphael being the famous Renaissance painter, and he is depicted here, the School of Athens, which is referring to the schools of Plato and Aristotle in dialogue with one another. It's also a reference to the history of philosophy up to the Renaissance, and it portrays well the historical tension in philosophy that would follow beyond the Renaissance. At the center of the dialogue, we have Plato and Aristotle, and they are in dialogue concerning that first question, what is real? And relatedly, the second question, how do you know? Now, both Plato and Aristotle believed in a holistic view of the world, a dualistic view that somehow included both the universal, non-physical stuff and the particulars, the physical stuff. Yet they differed on which was the more important emphasis. Plato distrusting like shadows the changing nature of the physical realm, and Aristotle seeing much good to be gleaned from studying the physical realm. Following the golden age of Greek philosophy, many people lost optimism amidst the wars and assimilation and began to focus on philosophy not as inquiry into deeper things, but as just a practical guide for how to live the happiest life. The road to Roman rule also brought an influx of perspectives, and with it new waves of skepticism. The Stoics did believe in a universal logos, a rational order, Yet they believed that this was part of the material world, and so everything was still ultimately matter with nothing beyond. So there was no higher truth able to transcend matter. The Epicureans challenged the authority of theological narratives and prescriptions of the time, and skeptics held either that higher truths and absolutes cannot be known, or because we can never speak of the way things are, but only of what appears to be, that we should just suspend all judgment. Now, while this does not assert relativism as a theory, it does nevertheless assume relativism in practice. Hellenistic philosophy therefore focused less on absolutes and more on ethics, yet not in the sense of moral rightness or wrongness, but rather on pragmatic prescriptions for how to go about attempting to live the happiest life. By the time of the Roman Empire claimed great tolerance for diversity. Yet within such diversity lies another variable which often precedes skepticism. Taken aback by pluralism, wow, there's a lot of views out there, the skeptic asks, with so many claims on truth, why think that my way is the right way? This is not to say that there were no claims on absolute objective truth within the context, but rather that the cultural atmosphere, like that of the 21st century, was quite conducive to a perspectival relativism. I have my way, you have yours, or they do their thing, we do ours. Indeed, it was in this context that we find the famous exchange between Jesus and the Roman governor. Jesus says, "Everyone who is of the truth will listen to my voice," to which Pilate responds, "Well, what is truth?" So already we are seeing a recurrent tension concerning claims to truth about non-physical, immaterial, universal ideas. The rise of Christianity provided a holistic view that had been lost, and so the Platonic Aristotelian dialogue continued. Influenced by Neoplatonism, St. Augustine attacked relativism and spoke to the nature of a struggle between the flesh and conscience, that is, between two cities, the city of heaven and the city of earth. According to Augustine, our loves are disordered. He called disordered loves cupidity. We love lower things. Plato would say we were chasing shadows. Happiness and the good life is realized once our loves are rightly ordered. Proper love he called charity. Thus, while Augustine affirmed many good things within the physical world, like Plato, he ultimately was encouraging us to look beyond the physical world in order to find the greatest sense of happiness and grounding for truth and knowledge. Influenced by Aristotle, however, Aquinas began to focus on the value of theologizing by starting with our experience within the natural world. He developed naturalistic arguments for God's existence and articulated the theory of natural law. Everything in the created world expresses a divine reason, or logos, according to which it was designed. It is teleologically obvious to us, or that is, we understand by intuiting this grand order, that good should be done and evil should be avoided. We were designed to live, so murder is wrong. We were designed for food, so reproduction is good. We shouldn't kill our offspring, etc. Against relativism, from this perspective, there is objective truth and knowledge beyond the physical material realm, and we have access to this whether through innate ideas, that is, ideas already instilled within us, or through rational intuitions that we have from the light of nature, which reflects and bespeaks a higher eternal law, or what C.S. Lewis would call a deeper magic. So, as with Plato and Aristotle, so too with the medieval philosophical theologians, the upstairs, the immaterial realm, was understood as fact. That is, many of the deepest truths about reality are immaterial truths. Still, people differed over what is the most important emphasis for understanding such higher truths. Should we focus exclusively on pondering the higher things because the lower things can distract us? Consider monks who live a lifestyle of abstaining from physical pleasures in order to ponder and meditate daily on higher truths. Or ought we to study the natural world, the lower things, to understand the higher truths more fully? If God created the world as good, then many things about our physical experiences are good, and the world is worth studying. The shift toward modernity contained a complex intertwining of variables that really set the stage and framed the philosophical tensions of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment can be understood as the product of the scientific revolution, Renaissance humanism, the impact of the Reformation, along with a rise in skepticism and new challenges concerning the problem of certainty and knowledge. William Ockham was a theologian who argued that technically God is powerful enough to make me think I see this tangerine on the table, when in fact it is not real. So, how can I know that I'm not just a mind? Many of you felt the force of this question last week when you struggled with the question of how you could prove that you're not in the matrix. That was in the early 1300s. And then by the 1500s, Montaigne is arguing that people believe they have knowledge when in fact they do not. We believe what we believe because of our contexts. What can I know? He says the only thing that is certain is that nothing is certain. So theologians and philosophers are raising some tough questions that are challenging many people's grounding for certainty. Add to this the impact of humanism. Now, humanism is a celebration of nature in general and the human being as the pinnacle of nature. As we approached the Renaissance, there was a growing interest in the natural world and a growing confidence concerning our ability to conquer it. So it was a celebration of nature and humanity, along with a growing optimism concerning our abilities and our specialness. And this eventually encouraged certain anthropocentric attitudes. Look at what we can do with the power of our minds. Science and logic, these are all we need. We can find our own answers. We no longer have need for religion. So humanism is not exclusively a secular term, although it can be applied that way. Secular humanism, as it's called today, emphasizes the ability of the human mind to acquire everything it needs without leaning on religious texts or ideas. So if you come across this notion of religion as kind of an ignorant view and science and reason as the elite view, that's more of a secular humanist influence. Though it can be applied that way if you use the phrase secular humanism, humanism in itself was a celebration of nature and the human being. Well, that aligns with many points on theism. So there was also religious humanism as well. If you are of the perspective that God made the world good and God made human beings special, and rather than taking the view that everything about the world is negative and we have to escape the world in order to be holy, but rather seeing the world as imbued with goodness everywhere, and even the arts reflect human goodness and nature reflects the goodness of God, things like that. Well, that sounds very much like a humanistic view from the perspective of theism. So it's more of a theistic humanism rather than a secular humanism. Either way, we don't quite have that distinction at this point in the Renaissance, but we are starting to kind of push away in some circles. And so the question is starting to arise, do we really need religion or theistic explanations or prescriptions like we used to? And then you throw the Reformation into the mix. Now, the Reformation might mean many good things, but as far as the question we just raised, do we need religion anymore, or is the power of our mind enough? Then within the church, you have this challenge to authority and tradition in some senses. Well, for people who are ignorant of theology and people who are not really sure what all of the arguing is about, it can just help to reaffirm in some people's minds that religion is just a power play, and that we have no need for it anymore if we can just train our rational minds and acquire our information through science. So humanism is a good thing, but it can have a negative impact on the dualistic dialogue. So too, historically, Reformation was a good thing. It brought religion to the people in many ways, even in music. Participatory songs where you actually, the congregation sings along and participates in worship, that's the product of the Reformation. So there are some good things that come from it, but again, it's also, in some people's eyes, a challenge to authority. And so what we're going to see as we move along here is that from so many different angles, from within theology and within philosophy, and from the skeptics outside of religion, and from the humanists, and from people looking at the Reformation and just seeing a struggle with claims to truth, for a lot of people, they're just going to see the world is changing, and suddenly nobody really knows what's true anymore, and so many people are fighting over what is true and what we know and how we know and all of this stuff. So it's easy to see how skepticism might be just around the corner. Again, humanism was not an exclusively secular position, and in fact, in the Reformation, we see that. So the Reformation celebrated the intrinsic goodness of an order in nature and the special dignity of the human being as image bearers of God. Nevertheless, while the Reformation was significant in a good way, it was also seen as a major challenge to authority and tradition. Next, we have a series of events involved in the scientific revolution. Now, first of all, since we're talking about the Middle Ages, you should get out of your mind the notion that it's all church and science at each other's throats in the Middle Ages, and that's why it's called the Dark Ages. That's not correct information. And if you want more on this, you can go read several texts, but just the two off the top of my head are Science and Religion, A Historical Introduction by Gary Ferngren, and Galileo Goes to Jail and Other Myths About Science and Religion by Ronald Numbers. So, contrary to popular belief, or doxa, as we learned last week, there are many points in which the church and science were in unity together. And in fact, usually, if scientists ran into some trouble, it was either with the doxa of the time, which wasn't necessarily enforced by the church, but the scientific community's expectations of what was common knowledge, or in the case of Galileo, there was a run-in not with the tradition of Scripture, but with the Pope of the time. But we should consider, what is the scientific revolution and why was it significant? Well, it was significant because it represents another layered, actually, challenge to authority, tradition, and to certainty. So prior to Copernicus, most people assumed that the heavens rotate around the earth and the earth is fixed. Copernicus's revolution was simply to raise the question, well, are we sure that that's the case? What if the heavens do not move around the earth? What if we are the ones that move? Well, for many, this was mind-blowing. Now, what a lot of people don't realize is that you can make an argument for geocentrism, the Earth being at the center of the universe. It's a complex theory. It's, as I understand, quite detailed mathematically, and it's messy. It leaves some issues unresolved, some questions unsolved, but technically you can make the case from what I understand. And as long as there are no contending theories, well, that's the best formula, the best theory available. Well, now, based on Copernicus's suggestion, Kepler says, if he's right that the heavens don't move, but we move, and the heavens are fixed, well, then I can do the math so as to place the sun at the center of the universe. And wow, it works. The theory of heliocentrism actually turns out to be much simpler and less problematic than geocentrism. And Occam's razor says when you have two contending theories, go with a simpler explanation. Yet again, this was mind-blowing for many in the context. And then there's Galileo. Now, one thing that Galileo offers is a new idea concerning dimensional space. Many thought of space as two-dimensional, like a piece of paper or a wall. In this case, stars could be something like a picture that you hang on a wall, so space is two-dimensional and the star is just hanging there, or, as was believed by some, imagine that you took paper and formed it into a globe. And imagine that you poked holes all over this globe. Now, if it's dark inside the globe and light is shining in the room on the outside of the globe, well, if you were inside the globe, you would see the light coming in through those holes. This is how some people envisioned the stars of the time. So, this notion of space as having depth was unheard of. But here comes Galileo, and he's saying, maybe it's not two-dimensional. Maybe space keeps going. It has depth. And this, too, was yet another mind-blowing idea. It's also really interesting to map the history of the arts with the history of philosophy, because around the time that Aquinas is talking about how important nature is within God's plan, you see a shift from paintings that emphasized the higher stuff and had no reference to nature. Also, people's feet weren't planted on the ground, but it looked like they were standing on their tiptoes. And now you have the shift in which their feet are planted firmly on the ground. And as we move more to the Renaissance, you begin to see more nature and more animals and naturescapes. And as we see the rise of humanism, where people are feeling good about humanity and human beings as being special, we start to see portraits for the first time. Well, coinciding with Galileo's ideas about space having depth, we begin to see artists exploring depth in painting as well. But that's not all that Galileo said. He also suggested that maybe there is an important difference between primary and secondary qualities of our experience. Now, this is a big deal. This dress caused a great debate of its own several years back, as people could not agree as to whether the dress was black and blue or gold and white. As it turns out, when we experience some things, our brain tries to predetermine our experience and sometimes adjust or correct data that is not expected to be part of our experience. In this case, some people's minds predetermine that the lighting in the room is natural, as if the dress is close to a window, and so they see the dress as black and blue. While other people's minds predetermine that the lighting is artificial, like a yellow light, and so their minds see the dress as white and gold. So here's the problem. If secondary qualities like color reduce to subjective perceptions, and if these can be contrary and mistaken, then why should we believe in objective universal values? I cannot even trust my experiences within the physical world. So how do I know that morality is not merely perception and opinion? How can I even know that I actually know what I think I know? All of this led to a shift in emphasis to begin thinking of the universe in purely mechanistic and mathematical terms. And this led to a new form of materialism. This shift in knowledge left many philosophers with these four perplexing problems. What is the place of mind in a world that's all matter? What is the place of value in a world that is all physical fact? What is the place of freedom in a world that is all mechanism? And is there any room left for God at all? So now we are ready to begin discussing the dialogue of the Enlightenment, which is a tension between the school of rationalism and empiricism. So rationalism is the philosophical view that our most foundational aspects of knowledge are acquired through reason alone, without the aid of the senses, whether through direct intuition of a greater reality, or even perhaps through an embedded awareness, ideas that are innate to human beings. Mathematical knowledge may be the best example of this. On the view of empiricism, on the other hand, direct experience is foundational for obtaining knowledge. The notion of innate ideas is largely denied, and it is argued instead that knowledge comes from sensory experience and inductive reasoning based on sensory experience. Today we walk the rationalist road, and in the next class we will take the empiricist turn. As early as Plato, we can already find the idea that we have an innate knowledge of the forms present at our birth. Knowledge, then, is simply a matter of recalling what we already know. In Plato's Meno, Socrates argues for the existence of innate ideas by asking a young slave, an unschooled boy, to solve a geometry problem. This involves doubling a square and solving for the area. Now, at first, the boy is confused, but as Socrates presses, he reveals that the boy already possesses all the information necessary for solving the problem. Now, as we saw earlier, throughout the history of philosophy, this tension between the physical and the rational is present. We also saw, even in ancient Greek philosophy, the development of rationalism, the notion that you always follow an idea to wherever it leads, even if it's an uncomfortable conclusion. And throughout much of history, for example with Plato, arguments have been largely rationalistic in nature. But it is not until the Enlightenment with René Descartes that we consider rationalism as a unique school of thought in contrast to empiricism. René Descartes is the French rationalist philosopher who developed a method of scientific investigation and argued that all knowledge is derived from the truth of one's experience. Faced with two perplexing questions, how can I know that I'm not dreaming right now? And supposing there exists an evil demon who enjoys manipulating all of our minds so as to think that we are experiencing a physical world when in fact it's not there, Descartes' intent is to provide a firm foundation for knowledge. How can I know that I'm not dreaming? And how can I know that the physical world is actually there? So Descartes comes up with a scientific method for investigating the contents of the mind. And as a mathematician, geometry is key to investigating our certainty and knowledge of certain things as matter of fact. His method in defeating skepticism is to become a skeptic, to play the skeptic's game even better than they. And he does this by doubting everything. Now, to doubt everything, the skeptic must be willing to doubt not only what they know, but also what they cannot know. If knowledge is like a box of puzzle pieces, wherein the puzzle pieces represents all of the ideas which we think we know with certainty, Descartes is going to turn the box over and dump all of the pieces onto the floor so that nothing with certainty remains in the box. His method then involves piecing back together that puzzle according to 4 rules that he establishes, and he commits himself to accept nothing that can be doubted. According to Descartes, only beliefs that are clear and distinct can count as knowledge. So he's dumping out all the puzzle pieces of his worldview, and he's going to examine each piece carefully, and only those pieces that can be called clear and distinct will he place back in the box, and only with those pieces will he attempt to put the puzzle back together. He records the problem, his method, and his series of arguments across a series of essays called the Meditations. The purpose of Meditations, and there are 6 of them, is to establish once and for all a foundation for knowing the external world. And he will do this by proving the existence and nature of God and the soul. His 4 rules are these. He vows never to accept anything for true which I did not clearly know to be such. That is to say, carefully to avoid precipitancy and prejudice, and to compromise nothing more in my judgment than what was presented to my mind so clearly and distinctly as to exclude all grounds of doubt. To divide each of the difficulties under examination into as many parts as possible and as might be necessary for its adequate solution. To conduct my thoughts in such order that by commencing with objects the simplest and easiest to know, I might ascend by little and little, and as it were step by step, to the knowledge of the more complex, assigning in thought a certain order even to those objects which in their own nature do not stand in a relation of antecedence and sequence. And to make enumerations so complete and reviews so general that I might be assured that nothing was omitted. So he's going to only accept as certainty or knowledge those things which are clear and distinct, or clearly and distinctly obvious, things that cannot be doubted. He's going to break down all ideas into as many parts as possible to examine them as thoroughly as possible. He's going to progress from the easier ideas to the more complex ideas, and he's going to scrutinize these ideas so completely and review them as oft as possible so that he might be assured that no stone was left unturned in order to secure certainty. So I'll briefly survey the Meditations, and then we'll circle back and look at some of them more closely. In the first meditation, he's really just outlining types of skepticism. For example, how do I know that I'm not dreaming? That what I think I experience physically in the world out there beyond my mind is actually there. And from this, he also comes to the possibility that there is an evil demon or a demon deceiver that enjoys manipulating our minds to make us see these things. What can we know and how can we know? So he resolves to just wipe the slate clean and doubt everything. His second meditation is his most famous. Recall last week we distinguished between direct realism and indirect realism. Direct realism is the view that when you experience something out there, like a cow, you are actually experiencing that thing as it is. With indirect realism, you never actually experience the world as it is out there. You always only, at best, experience your mental projection or a mental interpretation of the world out there. So here, Descartes considers the attraction of that view, indirect realism, but also how it naturally leads to skepticism. This is the essay in which he famously articulates his cogito. He comes to the conclusion that cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And he explains how this satisfies the rules of method by being something simple and indisputable, clear and distinct. I'm thinking about what I know. How do I know anything? Well, how do I even know that I exist? How do I know I exist? How do I know I? Well, what is I? Wait, I'm here thinking about things like whether or not I exist. There's a lot of stuff out there I may not know, but I'm here thinking so I can at least know with certainty that I exist. I cannot really know anything about myself, identity, or things like that, but I know that there exists an I, and that thing, whatever it is a thinking thing. So to think is to exist. I think I exist. This is all we have so far, but it is clear and distinct. In this meditation, he is pondering the nature of candle wax and how it changes and how things in the physical world can change, and our experience of physical things, therefore, has a certain degree of doubt tied to them. How do we ever know that we really know the thing out there that's changing? If it changes and our experience of things change, what can we really know with certainty about things out there? He concludes that whatever is known, we know through the intellect, not through the senses, because the sensual world always changes. In the third meditation, he examines the contents of our minds, including innate ideas, and he ponders the nature of subjective experience. He also struggles with solipsism. So in meditation 2, he had declared that he at least knew that he was a thing that thinks, but the problem of solipsism remains. Solipsism is the view that the self is all that can be known to exist. And so I might be alone in the universe while everyone else is just a figment of my imagination. How could I know that I'm not the only thinking thing? Well, he also explores differing degrees of reality, and he provides two arguments for God's reality. For he sees the establishment of God's existence as the only way out of solipsism, and establishing a confidence in belief that the physical world actually exists and we can know it. In the fourth meditation, he explores how errors are achieved in the process of our acquiring and asserting claims on knowledge, and how we can avoid error. He says that whenever our intellect encounters a perception, we should refrain from forming any judgments about the perception unless that perception is clear and distinct. In the fifth meditation, in order to work his way toward certainty of knowledge concerning the material world, he has to elaborate more on what material things are and also reaffirm the necessity of God's existence. In Meditation 6, he finally comes to the conclusion that we can know with certainty that material things exist, and they can be clearly and distinctly conceived. He distinguishes conceiving from imagining. He presents an argument for the distinctness of the soul from the body, and an argument for the reality of material things. He also speaks to the proper functions of the senses. If we misunderstand the functions of the senses, we can easily wander into error by attributing more to the senses than we should. And he also explains why God is justified in giving us senses, even if those senses sometimes deceive us. He explains that it is not God's fault that we try to judge things beyond the reach of our understanding, beyond what is clear and distinct. Our duty, he says, is to develop habits of avoiding error by being cautious with our judgments and only judging what we can be certain. Insofar as we restrain our impulse to judge to only what is clearly and distinctly perceived, then it will be impossible to err. Okay, so now let's go back and look at his method and argument more closely. Now, philosophy since Descartes has really been struggling to wrestle with many of the questions raised by his conclusions. Nevertheless, he was confident that he found his way back to certainty, and succinctly, this is how he did it. My senses sometimes deceive me. It is possible that I am dreaming or experiencing an illusion. I have no real reason for believing that I can actually trust in what I believe myself to know. Conclusion: I should suspend all belief. I will dismantle my reality puzzle and locate only those puzzle pieces which can be known as clear and distinct. Then I will assemble a puzzle using only these trustworthy pieces. In the second meditation, how do I know that these ideas I am having about the world actually match the way the world is? How can I know? How can I really know that my ideas are not being manipulated by some evil genius or demon? Wait a minute. I have ideas. I have ideas. Therefore, it is clear that the ideas exist, and it is clear that I exist to have them. Whatever I may mean or entail as a thinking thing, the I exists, and it exists as a thinking thing. Conclusion: I can know clearly and distinctly that I exist. Next, I find that I have ideas of perfection. But how do I come by these ideas? I know that I am not perfect, so where did the idea come from? So as I analyze my mind, I see that I actually have the idea of a perfect being, by which we mean God. But if I clearly lack perfection, and so far as I know, I am all that exists, how did I get such a notion of perfection, imperfect as I am? I could only understand such a concept if it came from my awareness of an actually existing perfect being. He goes on to provide a second argument. I exist. I am not able to cause my own existence. What caused me to exist? And he continues through this line of reasoning until he comes yet again to the conclusion, God must exist. From here, Descartes goes on to consider why we make mistakes and how we might avoid them. And then he goes on to entertain the possibility that the material world might exist, yet he does not have enough information yet to come to that conclusion. And so he sees the need to reinforce the conclusion that God must exist in order to get there. So he provides another argument for the existence of God. Finally, in the last meditation, He argues that since I have confidence in God's existence as a perfect being, therefore possessing qualities of perfection, such as goodness, and I understand that a good and loving God is not a deceiver, then I have good reason to believe that the material realm beyond the realm of my ideas actually exists. Nevertheless, I should continue to bear in mind that the material realm is clearly different from the kind of thing I am. Here he has reached the final conclusions of his work. I can now be confident that I am not being deceived. Because of this, I can also now be confident that material things do exist, and material things are clearly distinct from souls. So there is a clear difference between the material world, though it does exist, and the I, or what I am. So I am not ultimately physical, though I may find myself within the physical body. My core identity is immaterial. Note also that Descartes' certainty concerning the existence of material things is only grounded in our ability to move beyond our own mind. And this, he argues, is tethered to the existence of God. In today's lesson, we have traced a historical tension throughout ancient and pre-modern philosophy relating to our claims of knowledge concerning material versus immaterial truths. We framed the great philosophical debate of the Enlightenment between the schools of rationalism and empiricism. And then today we looked more closely at rationalism in general and the philosophy of René Descartes in particular. In the next lesson, we will look at the rising challenge of the empiricists. We will meet John Locke, an important and influential early British empiricist, and we will examine some of the ideas of George Berkeley. In the same way that René Descartes played the skeptic's game in order to deal with skepticism, Berkeley is going to play the empiricist's game in order to argue that if we actually embrace empiricism full force, we will inevitably find ourselves locked once more within the realm of ideas.